Welcome, everyone. I'm Xerxes Spencer, Manager of Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's presentation, Untouchable India, Impunity for Caste Violence, featuring Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellow Manoj Mitta. As many of you may know, the Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellows Program is an international exchange program funded by the US Congress that enables some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and outreach here at the NED. Now in our 15th year, we have hosted more than 250 fellows from over 90 countries since the program's founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for shining a spotlight on the status and struggles of India's most marginalized communities. As we all know, India is not only the world's largest democracy, but also home to the largest number of poor people in the world. Most of India's poor belong to low castes and suffer from the stigma of untouchability. Notable among them are Dalits, who rank at the very bottom of the caste system, and Adivasis, who are indigenous peoples. Together, the two groups number over 300 million, almost equivalent to the population of the United States. Despite the abolition of untouchability at the founding of the Indian Republic in 1950, and the subsequent enactment of special laws protecting Dalits and Adivasis, the two communities continue to suffer systematic violence and injustice. In his presentation, Manoj will tell us the incredible story of untouchability in India, its origins, its abolition, and how, even in the aftermath of abolition, justice continues to elude victims of caste violence today. He will also draw parallels between the abolition of untouchability in India and the elimination of slavery in America, including the struggle for civil rights in both countries. Manoj is a Delhi-based journalist focusing on law, human rights, and public policy. He has served as senior editor at two of India's leading newspapers, The Times of India and The Indian Express. He was also founding director of the Foundation for Media Professionals, which works to uphold standards of journalism in India. He has published two critically acclaimed books on sectarian strife in India, The Fiction of Fact-Finding, in which he questions the exoneration of Narendra Modi in the 2002 Gujarat riots, and When a Tree Shook Delhi, the 1984 carnage and its aftermath. Manoj has completed a year of primary research and interviews in India and is now devoting his fellowship to drawing up his findings and working on a book tentatively entitled Untouchable India, Impunity for Caste Violence. I will now turn the floor over to Manoj, who has promised to speak for no more than 30 minutes, but it's okay if you go a little longer since we don't have a discussant. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NE Democracy. If you haven't already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved in preparing for today's event, most especially Research Associate Ian Graham for his vital assistance with Manoj's project and today's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Xerxes, for your very generous introduction and all your support. But I have a bone to pick with you. I noticed while you were introducing me, a lot of what I will be saying in the course of my presentation has been preempted by you. Never mind. I hope. Sure. Yeah. And I will, before I start my presentation, I must thank National Endowment for Democracy for giving me this fellowship, which has been a wonderful opportunity for me to do um, further research on my book project. It's something I needed to do to come here um, because I was also looking at drawing parallels with the system of racism and the impunity surrounding racism. And there was no better place than Washington, D.C. for getting that kind of a perspective. It gave me an opportunity to interact with a range of experts here and elsewhere in US. And at NED itself, there have been so many talks and guests coming here, which served the purpose of deepening my understanding of this issue. And this fellowship, the way it is structured, the facilities you have here, including that of uh, research associates, the one I have had the pleasure of interacting with is Ian Graham. As Xerxes said, he's been invaluable in doing my work here. So thank you for all that, Carl, and the rest of you, Chris and Sally, of course, the head of the fellowship program. You've all been incredibly supportive. My heartfelt thanks for all that. So now let me come down to my presentation. It's something which I've been looking forward to because it marks the conclusion of my 5-month stint. I have only a few days left now. And I'm beginning my presentation with this ad. Many of you here may be familiar with it. This campaign, tourism campaign of India, which has been going on for years. And this particular ad cleverly deploys stereotypes associated with India: eternal, spiritual, tranquil. But more importantly, I want you to notice the slogan, Incredible India. This has been the recurring theme of the campaign, the tourism campaign of India. Now, inspired by this slogan and playing on words, my presentation on caste violence is titled Untouchable India. And untouchable anyway has more than one meaning. So who are these untouchables, so-called untouchables? This is a definition I came across in the course of my fellowship here. History's longest standing oppressed people. I thought it very eloquently conveys the message. A very pithy way of giving you the gravity of the situation they have been placed in for a long, long time. And it's a language that I came across in something known as the Declaration of Empathy, adopted right here in DC, not too long ago, a couple of years ago, on the birth date of Martin Luther King Jr. A group of African Americans and Dalits got together, and this Declaration of Empathy was adopted as an expression of solidarity on the part of African Americans to Dalits. And this is how they worded it. And I'm very pleased to tell you that one of the moving spirits behind that Declaration of Empathy is here with us this afternoon. I'm happy to recognize Mr. Royal Amin Ponder. Will you please do me the honor of standing up so that everybody can see you? So he is among the people I interacted with here, and I was telling you how much I gained through that. Now, given the sheer persistence of this practice, untouchability suffered by Dalits could well be regarded as an eternal facet of Incredible India. Remember that word eternal which they used, but surely in a very different sense. Now, though central to Orthodox Hinduism, caste prejudice is rampant across religions in South Asia. And it's ironical, though, that caste prejudice is rooted in a religion which takes pride in its lofty conception of humanity as embodied in this old Sanskrit saying, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means the entire world is one family. The entire world is one family, and yet it had this very retrograde practice which was based on this notion of inequality, and how it worked and all that we will see in due course. Untouchability has also been described by a leading human rights group, Human Rights Watch, as the hidden apartheid of the world's largest democracy. Another apt way of conveying the problem. Now, this malady persists despite its abolition. At the very founding of the Indian Republic in 1950, Article 17 of the Constitution says, untouchability is abolished and its practice in any form is forbidden. The enforcement of any disability arising out of untouchability shall be an offense punishable in accordance with law. I may clarify that the word disability used here has connotations relating to discrimination and prejudice arising out of untouchability, not necessarily in the sense in which you are accustomed to hearing this word in the US. And in the history of democracy, the abolition of untouchability in India is as much a milestone as, say, the abolition of slavery in the United States. This redressal of a historical injustice resulted from decades of struggle waged separately and from opposite directions by Mahatma Gandhi and Baba Sahib Ambedkar. When I say opposite directions, I'm referring to the fact that in this caste system, Gandhi was a member of one of the privileged castes, and Ambedkar was from the victim communities. So their perspectives differed, their approach differed, and in fact, they were often bitter rivals, despite antagonists, despite having a common goal. And Gandhi, of course, needs no introduction. Having captured popular imagination around the world, his non-violent battles against British colonialism inspired black leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and Barack Obama. But I noticed in the course of my fellowship here, not many people are familiar with Ambedkar. This is despite the fact that for Dalits, he is as big as MLK is to African Americans. Not only that, he is also India's James Madison, being the chief architect of our constitution. Now, untouchability, besides being the oldest form of oppression, is also the largest form of oppression. How do I say that? Let's first look at who these Dalits are. It's a self-chosen name, which means broken, downtrodden, oppressed, ground down. It's a term, in fact, that gained currency in 70s thanks to a movement known as Dalit Panthers. That's another indication of the influence US struggles have had on India. The Dalit Panthers were influenced or inspired by Black Panthers here. Now, these Dalits are referred to in legal parlance as scheduled castes. In the constitution, in laws, in government programs, they are hardly ever referred to as Dalits. This is the name they go by. And this term, scheduled caste, applies only to Dalits who are in Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist communities. And they number over 200 million. The last census, which was held in 2011, says that they constitute 16.6% of India's population. Now, along with scheduled castes, we have scheduled tribes, who are otherwise known as Adivasis. And they live mostly in remote areas such as forests and hills. And they number over 100 million. And they constitute 8.6% of India's population. Clubbed together in these laws for their vulnerability to caste violence, these communities number over 300 million. And as Xerxes already pointed out, that 300 million would make them almost equal to the US population. And in fact, this number does not count Dalit converts to Islam and Christianity, who are unofficially estimated to be about 50 million, or it could be even more than that. Right? There is no, the census, official census does not capture that, because official census is concerned only with scheduled castes, who in turn are limited to those who are in the Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh communities. Now, parallels between Dalits and blacks or African Americans were drawn right after the abolition of slavery. The first book on untouchability was published in 1873, within a decade of the abolition of slavery, was by Jyotiba Phule, the greatest champion of the downtrodden in the 19th century India. He was one of the heroes of Ambedkar. Now, the title Phule chose for his critique of untouchability was Gulamgiri in his language, the English translation being slavery. Now, his book dedication was remarkable, even if it might, in retrospect, sound naive. This is how it goes. To the good people of the United States, as a token of admiration for their sublime, disinterested, and self-sacrificing devotion in the cause of Negro slavery, and with an earnest desire that my countrymen may take their noble example as their guide in the emancipation of their Shudra brethren from the trammels of Brahmin thraldom. I'm aware that I haven't still explained these terms Shudra and Brahmin to you, but I will do so in due course. The point I would like you to bear in mind at this stage is the measure of gratitude he felt, a champion of Dalits, of the lower castes in India, felt for what was happening in India contemporaneously. Phule lived in the 19th century, and he was witness to what was happening then, the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and what have you. Now, the aftermath of the abolition, varying trajectories in United States and India. Although US had effected its abolition much earlier, India led the way in providing civil rights. After the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment in 1865, US took almost a century to give effect to the equality guaranteed by the 14th Amendment and the voting rights conferred by the 15th Amendment. I don't have to labor on this to an audience in DC, because you all very well know how on his famous March on Washington, Martin Luther King said that these very amendments were a promissory note that was never honored for over a century, right? So it was an allusion to this issue of the time lag between the enactment of these amendments and their being actually given teeth in the form of laws. Now that happened in India. When you make that comparison, the Indian Republic gave voting rights to Dalits right away. The Constitution was enacted in 50, and the Constitution had a provision guaranteeing universal adult franchise. So as a matter of course, in the first elections that quickly followed the enactment of the Constitution, that was in the year 1951-52, we had a whole lot of Dalits voting in the election and also contesting in the election. Whereas, India took just 5 years. In 1955, we had our first civil rights law. It was called, I'll come to those details later, but within 5 years, we had our law, which provided a range of civil rights. So India was ahead of US by at least a decade, as the latter enacted its civil rights law only in 1964, as I pointed out a while ago. I mean, as a result of Martin Luther King's agitation, and it came in the wake of President Kennedy's tragic assassination and all that. So while slavery has disappeared, I'm drawing these parallels in the trajectories in US and India. So while slavery has disappeared, in the sense that the legally sanctioned notion of property, of one man being the property of another, that was abolished in 1860s. So that legal structure was demolished. So that has disappeared. That you could no more trade in this property. You could no more inherit this property, right? Now, no such assertion of disappearance of untouchability can be made or is made even officially about untouchability. Because when it comes to untouchability, there wasn't any legal structure that sanctioned it. The problem was different. How it was different, I'll tell you in due course. So we had this de jure segregation in US. This slavery was replaced in US by segregation, as you all very well know, the Jim Crow era from 1870s onwards till 1964, till that civil rights law was passed. You had this de jure segregation in various public spaces. Now, that ended in 64. India formally never had de jure untouchability because it was never based on any law, right? Now, de facto segregation, when it comes to that, it exists in both US and India in ways that are at once similar and different. So what exactly is this beast called untouchability? Untouchability is an egregious manifestation of the caste ideology. Caste, in turn, is based on the religiously sanctioned Varna system, a four-tiered hierarchy of graded inequality perpetuated through endogamy. So in this pyramid, you will see Brahmin is at the apex, the priestly class, the intellectual, Kshatriya, administrator, the warrior, Vaishya, the businessman, Shudras, the working class. Now, it was not just about division of labor, but it was also, as Ambedkar famously said, division of laborers and putting them in this kind of hierarchy of graded inequality. Now, this peculiar hierarchy is marked by a descending order of purity. As you go down this, the purity, there is this peculiar notion of somebody being purer than another or somebody else being polluted. So that is what is so peculiar or perverse about this system. Brahmin is pure, and as you go down this, the purity reduces. And conversely, pollution increases. So there is this ascending order of pollution from Brahmin to Shudra. Now, Dalits and Adivasis are lower than even Shudras. They are therefore called Ati Shudras by Phule, or outcasts. They are beyond the pale of caste system. So the disability is the term that was used in the Constitution, or the extent of prejudice or the stigma of untouchability they suffered is on a different scale altogether. Now, this survey was conducted a couple of years ago, which brings out the fact that it's still so prevalent. I mean, it's just as racism is difficult to track in terms of the extent to which it prevails. There's so much of denial over that. People don't accept it. So it was not an easy task for this University of Maryland, not very far from where we are sitting, and this Indian think tank, National Council for Applied Economic Research. I'm happy to say that we have with us Dr. Abu Saleh Sharif, who was chief economist till not very long ago at NCAER. He was himself not associated with this survey, but he was the star of that organization. Now, they conducted a survey which was published 2 years ago, and this was the headline: 1 in 4 Indians admit to practicing untouchability. Now, how did they arrive at this figure? Now, that's a story in itself. Because, as I said, there is this issue of denial. So, over 42,000 people, the largest ever sample, were asked, do any members of your household practice untouchability? Sure enough, not many admitted so. So then the people who said no were put this test question. Would it be okay for someone from the low caste community to enter your kitchen or use your utensils? So that brought the truth out. Even then, there could have been a great deal of people who might have been guarded in their responses, but the figure that came out of the second question Now, that was not the only surprise, or rather, it shouldn't have come as a surprise, um, because the 27% could still be an underestimate. But the surprise lay in the fact that this was practiced not just by Brahmins, the obvious suspects, who were at the top of the purity ladder, right? So they had the most to lose when anybody comes in contact with them. So it was not just practiced by Brahmins, but every other community, even Shudras, and worse, even Dalits and Adivasis. That establishes this, the pernicious governing principle of caste, which is that every caste at every level, I should perhaps have mentioned when I was dealing with that pyramid, that at each of those slabs you saw, Brahmin, especially when it comes to the lower one, Shudra and the untouchables, there are actually thousands of castes. The classical formulation in the scriptures was four-tiered Varna structure. But in practice, what you see is a whole lot of castes which are fitted into this basic framework of Varna. And so among these castes, also there would be, even within the Shudras category, you have castes which look down upon each other. Okay, I am a higher Shudra and you are a lower Shudra. I am a higher Dalit and you are a lower Dalit. From where I come, Andhra Pradesh, a Mala is apt to look down upon Madiga. So now, and the surprise doesn't end there. Sikhs, Muslims, and Christians, who supposedly belong to more egalitarian religions, they are also infected by what is essentially a Hindu malady. Now, both sides of the caste divide blame religion for untouchability. The survey question about the kitchen is reminiscent of what Swami Vivekananda, an icon of the Hindu right, said way back in 1897. We are just don't touch us. Our religion is in the kitchen. Our God is the cooking pot. And our religion is don't touch me. I'm holy. If this goes on for another century, every one of us will be in a lunatic asylum. And Vivekananda said this in 1897. And he gave a deadline of a century. If you don't get over this in a century, now over 120 years have passed since he said that. So by his logic, we should all be in a lunatic asylum. Now, Ambedkar echoed a similar disgust in the 1937 preface to his best-known book, Annihilation of Caste. He said, I shall be satisfied if I make the Hindus realize that they are the sick men of India and that their sickness is causing danger to the health and happiness of other Indians. So, the lunacy in Vivekananda's terms or sickness in Ambedkar's terms. Only recent examples. The earliest I'm going to is September 2014. Here's a headline which is self-explanatory. A Dalit boy goes to a school wearing a wristwatch, and even that causes offense to non-Dalits. So his wrist is cut off for that. And I personally, this happened much later, more recently, May 2015. I go and follow up on this story. And this related to this land reforms being implemented in Rajasthan, one of the few states where it was implemented to the extent of giving land to Dalits as well. And that became a cause of friction between Dalits and non-Dalits. And in one such instance, 3 Dalits were mowed down under a tractor. And subsequent to that, in June 2015, this brings out another dimension of untouchability. It shows that untouchability doesn't mean only touch. It can extend to even the shadow of the Dalit. Even the shadow of the Dalit can be polluting. This mindset can be that pernicious. A Dalit girl's shadow falls and that causes that instance of violence. Another bizarre repercussion from September 2015 of another repercussion of land reforms. A Dalit woman is stripped, forced to consume urine in Madhya Pradesh. October 2015, teacher beats up Dalit boy. And one would think that this kind of a retrograde mindset only illiterate people would have. Here's an example of a teacher also being susceptible to this. And this example of a couple of Dalit children being killed as a result of some dispute relating to mobile phone created a bit of a splash because it was not very far from the capital, New Delhi. And it was quickly followed by a very controversial statement by minister belonging to the community that allegedly perpetrated this particular instance of violence, that was Rajputs. Now that minister likened the killing of these Dalits, or this incident at any rate, to the stoning of dogs. So that created a big controversy, and rightly so. And this example, some of you may have already heard about it. Even as we speak, there's a controversy raging over this. There have been many instances of students committing suicides in Dalit students committing suicides in universities because of the discrimination and prejudice they face, even in centers of higher education. But this particular one, sort of went viral. This particular instance created a sensation around the country, partly because of this very poignant suicide note. It was probably the most widely published, circulated, analyzed, parsed note, and it's led to a polarization of society like never before. And it's also because, what added fuel to the fire is this evidence suggesting that some political leaders drove him to suicide. Now, let's look at, we come to now the substance of what I'm really probing in the course of my fellowship and what is related to my book project on untouchability. And that relates to a couple of paradoxes. Paradox of the abolition leading to escalation in violence and impunity. Far from reducing its incidence, the abolition of untouchability has led to mass killings of Dalits. Since the year is significant because it shows that throughout the first decade, 50s, there was no such, not a single instance of massacre of Dalits. And till 1968, there was nothing like that. In 1968, in Tamil Nadu, it quickly followed a change of government, a change of a ruling party. For the first time, Congress Party, Indian National Congress, that was the ruling party, the party that is supposed to have brought independence to India. Now, in the immediate aftermath of independence, they had complete domination for years. And in Tamil Nadu, they lost power for the first time. And Congress itself represented a kind of coalition of Brahmins and Dalits and Muslims. So that is supposed to have been broken by that. And we had Shudras coming to power. And that of violence escalating is captured in the succession of special laws, because they have been enacted with increasing severity to penalize untouchability. Now, despite these special laws and the growth in Dalit assertiveness, or rather because of Dalit assertiveness, most cases have resulted in acquittals of the accused. Impunity, this impunity adds to the paradox of the escalation of violence. Now, laws reflecting the increasing virulence of untouchability. 1955, Untouchability Offences Act. As I mentioned a while ago, this was the first civil rights law in India, and it introduced this presumption that if a Dalit is a victim of any prejudice or discrimination, it will be presumed that it is on account of his birth or of his caste. Now, this law did not pay much attention to aspects of physical violence because it hadn't yet attained menacing proportions. 1976, Protection of Civil Rights Act. The language suggests the Civil Rights Act was obviously inspired by the Civil Rights Act of US 1964. They tightened this law. They introduced a provision which said that anybody convicted of an offense under this law will not be allowed to contest elections, an aspect that we who are gathered here at National Endowment for Democracy should be particularly interested in. Now, but even this law did not make much change as far as physical violence is concerned, despite the first massacre of Dalits in 1968. It's possible that lawmakers at the time regarded that 1968 massacre at a place called Melavelavu in Tamil Nadu as a one-off occurrence, because there was no violence after that on that scale at any rate. So, but as it happened, in 1977, the very next year, there was a big change in the political landscape in India. What happened in Tamil Nadu in Congress loses power at the state level. At the national level, Congress lost power for the first time, following a period called emergency, which was when civil liberties, elections, and they lost for the first time. Now that led to a whole lot of new socio-political dynamics in the rural landscape. And from 77 onwards, there has been a spate of massacres in India, across the country. And that led to, following a series of massacres, the enactment of Prevention of Atrocities Act in 1989, where for the first time, violence, these massacres became the focal point of the legislation. And they came up with graphically defined atrocities, provided special courts and enhanced penalties. And in 2015, just a few months ago, in fact, December 2015, this law, Prevention of Atrocities Amendment Act, was passed, and it was brought in and it was notified on 1st January 2016. So it's Act number 1 of 2016. So the issue we are talking about is as live and as current as that. Due to further escalation of violence against Dalits, it plugs loopholes and incorporates more atrocities. So even though the 1989 law itself was supposed to be very stringent, it had little effect on the spate of violence. If anything, it got worse. So that prompted our parliament to come out with yet another law, tightening it further. Now, how atrocities go way beyond civil rights of prejudice and discrimination. Civil rights issues, you would all be very familiar with discrimination in public spaces, right? Now, the graphically codified atrocities in the 1989 and 2015 laws are crimes that are very peculiar to India. How peculiar they are, I'll try and give a sense of them from a few instances out of the 29 listed atrocities in the 2015 law. Here's one. Puts any inedible or obnoxious substance into the mouth of a Dalit or Adivasi, dumps excreta, sewage, carcasses, or any other obnoxious substance in their premises or at the entrance of the houses of these Adivasis, garlands with footwear or parades naked or semi-naked. If you recall, one of the stories I mentioned had this Dalit woman being stripped naked. Provision would apply, and she was forced to drink urine. So this provision conveys that these graphically codified atrocities are not a result of somebody's imagination. They were responding to the crimes, these very peculiar crimes that were happening on the ground. And that is what forced them to put this kind of language, peculiar as it is, in the statute book. Now, here's a very telling example of untouchability subverting democracy. Among the many instances, I'm citing this one because I'm here, as Xerxes mentioned, as a democracy fellow, and we are all gathered here at National Endowment for Democracy. And as the headline here says, this particular massacre is a blot on grassroots democracy. Why is it so? Dalit, he defied the diktat of the dominant caste in his region and went ahead and contested elections in a local body. We have Raj. Now, they didn't mind their legislator at the national level, an MP, or a legislator at the regional level, who we call MLA, Member of Legislative Assembly, being a member of a Dalit. As a result of this affirmative action, we have political reservations by rotation or whatever. So we have some constituencies where they get elected. Now, in this particular constituency of a Panchayati Raj, of a local body, it was the turn of a Dalit. Now, they found that unacceptable. So they didn't want any of the Dalits to contest. Now, this man defied that diktat and contested, and he had to pay for it with his life, because after he got elected, he was killed along with 5 of his followers. Now, patterns of impunity. This is really the final section of my presentation. How the legal system of checks and balances have failed in cases of mass violence against Dalits. 6 ways I have identified for the purpose of this presentation in the course of my research, ongoing research. Now, the first one is delaying tactics. This is a very obvious one, a very widely recurring problem that, the particular example I have cited here is Chunduru massacre. It took place in 1991, but the trial finally commences in 2004. This is not the conclusion of the trial. It is commencing in 2004, by when quite a few of the witnesses had died of old age and other natural causes, and many would have forgotten details of that. And how they managed to get this put off by so many years is because the trial judge was very accommodating of all manner of objections that were raised by defense counsel. Oh, this venue of the trial is not suitable. Oh, the prosecutor is a member of a certain really Dalits because they probably converted to Christianity. These are the kind of issues that were raised and delayed the trial by so many years, right? So this is a recurring pattern. I'm citing just one example. The next one is where the trial takes place. This is another case which I personally went and saw for myself in Bihar. The trial took place not too long ago, though this is of massacre that took place in 90s, in 99, but the trial took place only in 2014. Fast track court. So the fast track court dealt with this case in 2014, and it had about 50 witnesses deposing. Exactly 50, not about. Exactly 50 witnesses with an almost monotonous predictability. They would come and say, I remember nothing. So they were all turning hostile, one after another. And the prosecutor or the trial judge deem it necessary to pause the trial and say, hang on, what's going on here? Are they coming under, the very obvious question, are they being intimidated? Are they coming under pressure? So should we not be ordering protection to them? Now, this is something which they ought to have done also because, given my familiarity with what's been happening on sectarian strife, I dealt with the Gujarat issue. My last book was on that. Now, one of the reasons why there has been a breakthrough in Gujarat in terms of impunity is because of the intervention made by the Supreme Court. That made a dent in impunity in a case where a member of the government, the Modi government of Gujarat, Maya Kodnani, was allegedly involved. Now, the Supreme Court ordered security, central paramilitary forces security for every one of the witnesses so that they go before the court and depose fearlessly. And that is how it resulted in a historic convicted, right? Now, that kind of activism or concern was not shown at all. Here, the trial judge was only too happy to go through the motions, the farce of the trial, where every one of those 50 witnesses turns hostile, and at the end of it, surely enough, the judgment he delivers results in acquittal. Now, that is the second, and that's by no means is limited to this case, but I'm citing just one example to make my point. Now, the third one is where at the end of the trial, despite such odds, the trial court succeeds in convicting them. There have been instances where human rights groups and others have been with the victims and given them that confidence to depose. And one such case was of Lakshmanpur Bate. This is the biggest ever caste massacre where about 58 people were killed, again in Bihar. And as a result of those very valiant efforts, the trial court convicted 26 of them, many of whom were given death sentence, by the way. Yet, when the same matter went before the appellate court, which is Patna High Court, in no time, the High Court overturns the trial court's judgment and acquits every one of them. So in my book, I will be juxtaposing these two judgments to see how two judicial bodies came to such diametrically opposite conclusions on the basis of the same set of facts, because there was no second trial. It's the same trial, and this is the outcome of it. Now, another pattern relates to this issue of shielding police officials. Very often in these, as with the complicity of the local police, it would be errors of omission and commission. Now, they would look the other way, or in some cases, they would even facilitate the violence. But they never, the prosecution or the police themselves would never bring any of these police officials, these errant police officials, to justice. But in the case of Ramabai firing, there was no option, because that was a case of police using excessive force, of police firing at a group of Dalits who were protesting the desecration of Ambedkar's statue. So the police comes and without any provocation opens fire, leading to the death of about 10 people. So the man who ordered that firing was Manohar Kadam, and he was convicted, therefore, by the trial court for murder, and he was given a life sentence. But the system then reacts with such alarm. It's as if they have a vested interest in ensuring that no justice is done where somebody from the police state structure is accused. So the Bombay High Court immediately suspends his life sentence and grants him bail, and he's never been really in jail, and that's where the case is stuck. Now, yet another such shielding is in relation to linchpins or ringleaders being shielded, and that leads to there's been a pattern of vigilante justice, whether it is Karam Chedu or in Tamil Nadu we had the Skilvenmani case, and then in Bihar, a series of massacres that took place. Ranveer Sena is a group that is often likened to your Ku Klux Klan. They are accused of being involved in a series of massacres, but the chief of Ranveer Sena himself was never made an accused in, say, Lakshmanpur Bate case, although he was available. So that forced some people from the underground, left extremists, to resort to this kind of violence. He was shot dead. Now I come to the last such pattern. This is a case where, the justice is done formally. Somebody is convicted on some charge, but then the court would go out of its way to deny the caste angle, to deny that it is a hate crime. They would pass it off as just another crime. And the headline that I have put here says, ironically, just another rape story. It was a story done by Sabrina Buckwalter, who I'm happy to say is here with us. She's sitting there. She did more than just a story. I want to, just as I was happy to recognize her, let me first tell you what she did. She was the one who blew the whistle on this caste atrocity, because what came out first was just a routine story which said, a group of Dalits, all members of one family, mother, daughter, and two sons, were killed allegedly because the mother was up to some immoral activities, and this was an instance of a vigilante action going out of control. It was not quite adding up. The media should not have swallowed this line, but that is how it was reported, and it stayed that way for almost a month till Sabrina went there. And when she goes there from Bombay, she was in Times of India as an intern. She goes there. No regular seasoned correspondent thought it fit to go all the way there. So she, on her own initiative, she goes there. And what she finds there is, even after a month, people there were so brazen, they didn't even bother to clean the scene of crime. She goes to the humble home of this Dalit family, and she sees evidence of undergarments lying there, of that spice powder that was used used in that whole gang rape and so on, to smother them and so. And she comes back and does that report. And that led to an awakening in the society, in Dalit communities, and they led to, there were a whole lot of protests in that area, and those protests were sought to be suppressed by the local government, by the Maharashtra government, and there were instances of police firing, and some more deaths took place as a result of a chain of reactions triggered by her story. And then the story doesn't end there. The trial court goes on to give a judgment which, the prosecution was forced to acknowledge that there was this allegation of sexual violence, and that suggested that it was not just a vigilante action going wrong, but it was some caste angle, because there was some dispute relating to land, and that caste prejudice was all very evident, that pattern of Dalit women being dragged to the streets naked and paraded and all that. So those elements were there, yet it went on to say, no, it was only murder, because there was no evidence, there was no way that part could have been denied. Murder, yes. No rape, and by no means was the caste angle involved. So no convictions under the Prevention of Atrocities Act. Now, coming back to Sabrina's case, before the trial court judgment, as with most cases, the judgment comes much later, but within a few months of her story, because of the unrest that was triggered by her story, she had to pay a price for it. Within a few months, it was her visa was due for renewal, and the government refused to renew it. They tried very hard to renew it. She had to come back. And then repeatedly she applied for visa because she's so passionate about covering India as a journalist. She repeatedly applied. As late as 2014, she apparently got a job and she applied again. And every time they would deny it. That I'm mentioning this to give you a sense of how sensitive or how touchy India is to this issue of untouchability, to this issue of violence being brought to light. And they just didn't like some American journalist blowing the whistle on it. So I thought it was one very remarkable instance. So besides telling you about the pattern of impunity, I wanted to bring out that in this instance, had it not been for the courage she showed, the initiative she showed in unearthing the truth about that incident, we would perhaps have not known. Now we come to the conclusion. You can't legislate attitudes. Pretty obvious from all that I've said. No law can cleanse people of their prejudice, but it can deter them from committing atrocities if they are not assured of impunity. To make a dent in impunity, my book will bring out the different ways in which investigators, prosecutors, and judges contribute to the breakdown of institutional safeguards. Though entrenched as an electoral democracy, India is still far from a liberal democracy, owing substantially to the persistence of untouchability. Impunity for caste violence is unlikely to decline unless India makes its institutions more accountable. So, to sum up, I may recall the official slogan of Incredible India. India is indeed incredible, though not necessarily for reasons.
Thank you, Manoj.
Sorry for exceeding my time.
No, you've done a remarkable job shedding light on a very poignant and painful chapter in India's history with democracy, a chapter that is rich in paradox and irony, as you brought forth in your various slides and stories. We now have time for questions and a discussion with members of the audience. If you could identify yourself when you pose your question, that would be great. So we have two hands in the second and third rows, respectively. So we'll start with you, sir.
My name is Dr. Barwa. I'm a social activist on the Dalit and Adivasis issue for a long. And he mentioned about the Ramabai Ambedkar episode. I actually protested in front of the Indian embassy on this very issue, and with a press release. Anyhow, be that as it may, first of all, I must congratulate Manoj for a superb, very lucid and clear presentation. He addressed all the detailed issues, the failure of the judiciary, failure of the police, conniving with the criminals, and I hope his book will bring out a lot of important issues. And thank you, Manoj.
Thank you.
My name is Abu Saleh Sharif. I'm a development economist. Manoj, it was wonderful, very good. What I would appreciate is the very important efforts the government of India has made, especially after independence, to address the issue of the deprivation of Dalits through the quota reservation systems, and also through reserving political participation at all levels, including the one you showed at the panchayats. I think that deserves a special mention, that the governments, irrespective of which party is ruling us, is trying to address this issue, but it is the issue of attitudes, we have very rightly said. And that's where my next related question is. I'm also feel that within the democratic frame, excluding Dalits who got converted in Muslims and Christians, that has to be mentioned in either a box or in a special section in your book, because the discrimination after the conversion within this religion is also very harsh. It has not vanished. For example, the Dalits who are Muslims, or even the Dalits who are Christians, they face discrimination within their religion, and then the system doesn't recognize their issues. So I think there is a double whammy, and that needs recognition. And I know that one of the places where these attitudes can be changed is under education system, schools, Anganwadi centers, midday meals, particularly the issue of food distribution within school system, and the food distribution under the Anganwadi system, where infants are given nutrition. There is a huge discrimination which happens. To address that issue, now there are special Dalit-oriented schools which are separate from the mainstream, Dalit hostels which are separate from the mainstream, and Dalit-managed ICDS centers which are different. Now, it appears that it is addressing an issue, but actually it is causing a divide. So I request you to consider that as some of the arguments for future. And the last point is, why is that a group violence doesn't get justice in India? I mean, it applies to community.
Sure.
So maybe you could respond to Carl for his question.
Yeah, I appreciate all the suggestions you made, and I just want to clarify that my focus is on violence. I was bringing out the fact that after abolition of untouchability, this violence which did not exist earlier before independence, in the lifetime of Gandhi and Ambedkar, they never encountered this kind of violence. It is something that is entirely post-abolition. About 2 decades later it started. Right? So I'm dealing with that phenomenon and the impunity surrounding that. So that's my focus. As far as the issue of reservations, affirmative action, and all those sociological and historical, anthropological aspects are concerned, there have been lots of studies on that. what I'm focused on, is significantly there's nothing on that so far. That's been the thrust, therefore.
Okay, Carl, and then Rahul, and then Mike Allen.
First, Manoj, you know, we've started a discussion. It's just great to have you here and to have you doing this work here and in the United States. And I really appreciate the parallels that you drew between India and the United States. This is a kind of what you might call an ironic dimension to the special relationship between our two countries.
Indeed.
But having said that, I sort of talk and maybe reflect on a possible area of difference, or maybe there isn't a difference. And that's this. You know, we you know, in at the time of the Civil Rights Movement and immediately after the Civil Rights Movement here, when we, you know, passed these laws, there was an effort to talk about, okay, you can eliminate discrimination, but how do we achieve equality? The issue wasn't to end violence, and most of your talk has been about violence and impunity.
Yeah.
Here, it's discrimination where the equality.
Yeah.
How do you achieve equality? Maybe, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. That when this debate, the kind of post-civil rights movement debate, started here in the United States, there was something which we talked about called the Moynihan family, and the problem of fatherless homes. And it did trace back to slavery, where families were not, you know, did not have a stable family structure. Sometimes families were deliberately broken up, and it led to the absence of stable families, and that was exacerbated by both the problem of unemployment, the problem of jobs moving out of the cities, and also the migration from the south to the north. But it was a very, very serious problem. And in the Moynihan report, he basically said you can eliminate discrimination, but that doesn't mean you're going to get equality, because people have actually been damaged. Some people have been damaged by this history. And that's where the concept of affirmative action came from, that you don't just have people starting at the same point. You have to do something to help people who've suffered as a result of this history. And that, you know, what that suggested also was that within the black minority in the United States, there was a kind of a class division between of fatherless families, which is actually a much more serious problem today than it was 50 years ago when Moynihan published that report, a kind of class difference in addition to the race problem. And there were some people who wrote a lot about this. Does that dimension exist in India? And if it does, in other words, have untouchables been damaged by the history of untouchability, the discrimination against untouchability? And if you could really eliminate untouchability, or at least, you know, reduce it, not just in law but in practice, would the people who are untouchables be able to achieve economic and social equality, or would they be held back not just by the institutions of the society, but also by the damage that was done over this long history of untouchability?
Thanks, Carl. I gathered a lot of information from your intervention, but I'm not sure if I understood your question right. What does cross my mind at this moment is to mention that though India is a land of immense complexities and diversities, one aspect that runs across the country is this feature of Dalits typically being marginalized in their physical location in villages and small towns. They would all be condemned to stay in some ghettos outside the village or in some corner, and they would be condemned to perform some menial tasks. Now, this is a physical reality that the Indian Republic inherited. And when they are seeking to address it with a mix of measures, affirmative action, and these laws meant to check prejudice and discrimination, Now, this is where they come from. This is the starting point of the mainstream. Even they're coming into the village, walking on those streets, would be a cause for offense. So when we talk about their economic problems, their social problems, it's on a scale that is probably without a parallel. It is sui generis. Even blacks here in this environment, which is more prone to liberal values, more accommodating of liberal values. When you had something like the Declaration of Independence talking about this equality as a self-evident truth. Now you lived through those contradictions, through those hypocrisies, so you had to work them out over the decades and centuries. We are at a much earlier stage in that sense. Though we, as I pointed out in my presentation, though our civil rights law actually, which was a year after Brown versus Board of Education, in a sense it was also inspired by that. In one sense it was a sequel to our 1950 Constitution. In another sense, it was also inspired by your Brown versus Board of Education. But your law came much later than ours. It didn't take long for the two countries to get, be at the same level, I would think. There's little to choose when it comes to issues of discrimination. Even in the course of my fellowship, I was witness to a whole lot of debates going on here about impunity in cases relating to Ferguson and Baltimore and so on and so forth. So, it's still a work in progress for me. I'm very struck by the parallels that one can draw and the lessons that we in India can learn from your experiences. I'm also mindful of the fact that impunity, which is really my major concern, operates very differently out here because our legal systems are different. The kind of leeway and autonomy you give to your prosecutor, the district attorney, or the kind of say that lay members of, say, the grand jury would have, or the jury that is conducting the trial would have. These are aspects that are peculiar to your country. It operates very differently in my country. Yet there are a whole lot of parallels that I could draw and lessons that I could apply. That's the challenge before me. And I appreciate the opportunity I got through Ned. Thank you very much.
So we have a number of other hands raised. Let's turn now to Rahul Kwanda with his question.
Yes, good afternoon. I'll be rather brief because the bulk of what I was going to say or comment was exactly what you commented upon. So I still had my hand up, so I have my... When we were considering the Declaration of Empathy effort, a group of legacy families, these are all African-American families who are descended from Americans who are well-known, like Charles Drew, and the African-American descendants of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and the Quanda family who were enslaved by George Washington, Benjamin Banneker, Frederick Douglass. These were the families that came together to discuss what became the Declaration of Empathy, because we felt that although there are many similarities, there are also many differences. And some of us felt that the differences were greater than the similarities, and to a certain extent they are, and it is correct. But we felt that it was very important for us to stand up and take note, to go to the United States Congress, to appear in the United States Capitol, and to have the Dalits and the African-American legacy family representatives come together in the presence of our congressional representative and go on record to speak out about the condition, about the discrimination against the Dalit people, and how we as African Americans felt that it was very important. The Dalit Freedom Network here in Washington, D.C., I see Dr. Anna Steele over there. She was with the network at the time. And we really felt that it was very important. And once I had the pleasure of meeting Manoj, and he was brought to my attention because of what we were doing with Nasir and Famita. And it is very important for us as Americans, and African Americans in particular. And in my case, I'm from Washington, D.C. by way of Calcutta. So I'm a mixed African American, maybe a Dalit, I'm not sure. But it's very important for us in this country to take a stand, whether it's a small stand or a large stand, to research and to write, to know that there are people who are concerned, and express your concerns to him so that when he writes, he will be able to convey who he met with, what we said, what we're doing, and he can underscore what our laws say and what the enforcement mechanism is by comments that the people make. So I just wanted to underscore that and wish you all the best and look forward to reading.
Thank you. Okay, Mike Allen at the back, and then Ellie Smith in the middle.
Thank you. Mike Allen with the NED. I wondered if you could say a few words about the relationship between untouchability and the Naxalite insurgency, which was recently described as the world's least known but most dangerous insurgency, and by some estimates covers in the east and the south of India. Certainly seem to have been successful in mobilizing the Adivasis, particularly in the conflict and so on. So are they successful in mobilizing untouchables because of the democratic system's failure to address these issues in the way that you've so eloquently outlined?
And maybe Ellie could pose his question, then Manoj can respond to both.
Okay.
My name is Ellie Smith. The question I wish to ask Manoj is this. You said somewhere that a number of Dalits are converting into Christianity and Islam. Why are they converting to these two religions? And then my final question, I saw somewhere a student who committed suicide, because we know that education has not helped to wipe out these problems of, I know it happens all over the world, but in a country like India, has education not been able to help to fight against such prejudice?
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll first answer Mike. Oh, okay.
No.
You want me to take
address his Mike's and Ellie's question, and then we'll go to the gentleman
So
on my left.
Yeah. Mike's question was about this aspect of Naxalism, which is independent, at the same time very deeply connected with the issue of Dalits and Naxalites, Dalits and Adivasis. In fact, very often those who are activists working in these areas relating to discrimination and prejudice affecting Dalits and Adivasis, they risk being branded Naxalites. That's one common smear, and that becomes a justification for taking disproportionate action, applying stringent laws. We have an example of a teacher from Delhi University who's actually suffers from disability. He's physically incapacitated from even moving. He's 85% immobile, and yet he was accused of being a Naxalite with some. So it becomes very easy for them because he was working on issues relating to Adivasis in Chhattisgarh and so on. And just a couple of days ago, a journalist working for an online site, Scroll, was attacked because she was right in Chhattisgarh writing on issues relating to Adivasis, and there was a mob attack on her place. So this is, and again the allegation was that she was a Naxalite. She was serving as a conduit for Naxalites. This is something which they do over and over again. So, there is this political party in Bihar which has been fighting for these Dalits in these cases of mass violence. It's called CPIML Liberation. Now, that is also often called the Naxalite, and therefore the subtext of the usage of the term is, they are up to no good. Although it is a political party that is very much part of the parliamentary system, they contest elections. In the last Bihar assembly elections they contested and even won. And they are the ones who have been, who are responsible for this convictions in Lakshmanpur Bate case in the trial court stage because they stood by the victims. Yet they are tagged as Naxalites, which is a shorthand used by state authorities for being people who are anti-national. So this is all subterfuge which we have to, we and the media and civil society have to guard against. Now, as far as Ali's question is concerned, does education not bring down the problem of untouchability? Well, ideally, it should. Education is about instilling notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the irony is, these education institutions, even universities, often bring out these primordial instincts in a very blatant manner, and it's probably because education is one of the clearest casualties of the caste system. Caste system meant that education was the monopoly of only the upper castes. And it was very systematically, without any remorse, using some traditional or religious authority, was denied to them. I mean, so this is the mindset that we had to overcome by abolishing untouchability. When we abolished untouchability, it was not a legal structure, unlike in US. When they abolished slavery, it was a legal structure that was dismantled. In India, it was a mental issue, attitudes. And that is what I said. If after 60, 70 years, we are still grappling with such cases, if such instances keep happening even in universities, besides the issue of impunity, if there are such suicides taking place in universities, that is testimony to how little attitudes have changed.
Okay, we have time for one quick question, one quick response from Manoj, and then we must wrap up ASAP. So, Heiner?
Presentation. The one thing, though, that it seems to me
If you could speak up, sir.
the parallel with the Black Lives Matter movement and the subject of your study seems quite obvious. You haven't addressed movement, but I wondered if you could address it, because there the issue is violence and is impunity.
Very much in my mind. I like the attitude that they display. I came across this very striking T-shirt which a lot of them wear, which says, I love my blackness and yours. This kind of combativeness which they are displaying is evident even in the usage of the term Dalit. The term that was in that was used in India prior to Dalit was Harijan, which Dalits found patronizing, and they said, no, we would rather be known as people who are broken, people who are oppressed. So it's in the face. So there is much in common between these two groups, and I have taken note of that. Thank you for bringing it up.
Before this event, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but you are certainly welcome to approach Manoj at the end to continue the conversation. I just wanted to conclude by saying that before the event, we received a set of somewhat adversarial questions that Manoj and our friend Rahul have done a terrific job in responding to, and then others among you have asked less adversarial questions, but it's clear that the topic touches a nerve among members of India who would prefer to the country, and of course it strikes a chord amongst those others who are working towards the rights of vulnerable communities. I can't think of a finer and keener observer, analyst, journalist to bring this attention to light. I want to thank you for doing so, and I wish you continued success in the writing of your book. Thank you all.
Thanks all of